Welcome to the Strongest Steel Podcast. This is episode 11. I'm going to start by just acknowledging that here in the District 3 office, in Brett's office, Brett's on vacation actually, so bear with us. We're doing the podcast without our communications officer Brett, but we still have our Tyler and our technical team. But I want to acknowledge we are here on the traditional unceded stolen territories of Coast Salish people. In particular, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And we should, as always, acknowledge that colonial history of our country and work to move towards reconciliation with Indigenous people across British Columbia, across Canada, and around the world. We're continuing with our entourage of famous guests on the Strongest Steel podcast. And so today we have Randy Dillon, who is a longtime steelworker and IWA member, a member of IWA 3567 and then USW 2009, very recently retired, the one of the newest members of SOAR. And so we welcome Randy here beside me. And then online we have the real famous person, the most famous labor economist I know, Jim Stanford, who is pretty well known, I think, as the, working for the CAW and Unifor, and then now with the director for the Center for Future Work. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, about workers and how workers are doing, and in particular how they're doing in Western Canada, in BC, Alberta, and across the West. So that's the topic for episode number 11, and we're looking forward to it. And so I will just let Randy and Jim each say a little bit of a welcome from themselves, and maybe start with you, Jim.
Thank you very much, Scott and Randy. Great pleasure to join your Strongest Steel podcast. I think it's a wonderful initiative. I'm so glad to see your union and the labor movement more generally getting with the program in terms of different ways of getting the word out, including the podcast series. So a great honor to join you. I am a union economist. There are some who think that's a contradiction in terms, Scott, kind of like military intelligence, perhaps, or progressive conservative, perhaps, jumbo shrimp. Union economist, what the hell are you talking about? Unions are there to screw up the economy, aren't they? Not so. So I've spent my whole career showing the facts and figures about how unions are actually a good thing. We have a stronger society and a stronger labor market and a more efficient economy with the unions doing their thing. That is giving workers some collective power to try and get a better share of the wealth and safer workplaces and a fairer society. So that's my mission, and I now do that through our little labor economics think tank called the Center for Future Work, based in Vancouver, and do some work with the different labor federations and the CLC and some individual affiliates. Also, I've looked at the forestry sector, of course, a topic close to your heart, Scott, out west here.
Thanks, Jim, and great. You did great work for us on the Forest Worker Summit, and working with Ken Delaney and us and Unifor and the PBWC to put forward some thoughts about the still ailing BC forest sector and how we can kind of put workers first in that industry and moving forward. And really appreciate the work you did on that, and so glad that you could join us, and looking forward to a good discussion. Randy, how's retirement first, and then you can tell us a little bit about yourself.
It's been really great. I found myself, as many people find themselves, be too busy for the first number of months being retired, but I'm enjoying it very much, and enjoying not getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning every day, which I've been doing for quite a while. My main, the joy that I've gotten, the biggest joy I've gotten out of being a union member over the years is seeing not the benefit that it's brought to my fellow workers, but the benefit it's brought to their children, and to see how their parents have been able to afford to bring them into better schooling and all that kind of stuff to better their lives, and not become forest industry workers necessarily, like myself, although some of them do.
How long did you work as a in the industry you worked at?
46 years. I started off a 1,000-man mill and was almost all men in those days in South Vancouver, the Canadian White Pine.
Oh, you worked at Canadian White Pine, really?
Mm-hmm, for 5 years before they first curtailed, and that was great. It was the best job of my life. I worked on the river down there, and in the mid 80s, I went into lumber remanufacturing because I heard a lot of good things about were going to happen in that sector of the forest industry, which turned out to be a lie, actually. But I managed to stay at one place before it burned down for a year and a half, and then spent the following 36 years working for Kelfor Industries in the reman industry as well. Paid all my bills.
Yeah, that's great. And a long-time activist in the local and member of the local union executive and very active politically in the community as well. So
yeah, joined the NDP in 85, took a break and joined again in 2013. And I'm super pleased with the way our province has been run in the last 7 years.
Yeah, cool. Well, that's one of the things I wanted to talk about in this episode is Jim, you did a study or a paper for the Alberta Federation of Labor. I think titled something like "The Disappearing Alberta Advantage." And I grew up as a British Columbian, and Randy's been around in BC and obviously as well. And something I always heard about is this Alberta advantage. Like everything is better on the other side of the Rockies. Alberta, they got no tax, and everybody's got a job that pays them like twice as much as we make, and everything's great in Alberta. And from what I understand from seeing you present a couple times on your paper, if that ever existed, it no longer exists. Not to spoil your your comments, but can you just tell us a little bit about that paper and that work that you did?
Sure, Scott. Now, you're a BC native. I got to come right out and say I'm a born and bred Albertan. And I have to say that off the bat because if you criticize anything about Alberta and you're not from Alberta, they try to write you off as, an Eastern bastard or something like that. So I am born and bred Albertan, and I love the place, and my parents are still there, and I get back there a lot, and it's got a wonderful history and a wonderful culture. But this whole idea that Alberta is a land of milk and honey for the working people of the province is long gone. That's a fairy tale, frankly. And unfortunately, we've woken up from the fairy tale to a very tough situation for working people in Alberta. Once upon a time, it was true. The unemployment rate was low. There was, good availability of jobs. Alberta was a place you could move out to and find a job quickly and make decent money and support your family. And so, it wasn't all false. As recently as, say, 10 years ago, average wages in Alberta were about 18% higher than the average for Canada as a whole. And, that helps to explain why people would come from, the Maritimes or even from BC, from other provinces to Alberta to try and find a better economic future. Unfortunately, it's been all downhill over the last decade. So our report that we did for the Alberta Federation of Labor, they had a midterm conference a few weeks back in Calgary that I presented it at, and they did some media around, got some good media attention for the report. We just documented all of the different ways in which the conditions of life for an average worker in Alberta have gone downhill, starting with the availability of work. Alberta once had a relatively low unemployment rate. It now has one of the highest unemployment rates in Canada. Job creation in Alberta, even though the oil and gas industry obviously is still a critical industry in Alberta, not as central as it used to be, but still very important, has been making swaths of money in the last few years, but they are not reinvesting it and they are not creating a lot of work. So job creation in Alberta has been quite sluggish. Yet, in contrast, the population growth in Alberta has been very fast. There are still a lot of people moving to Alberta. I don't know if they've been, influenced by those ads that Daniel Smith's government put in different parts of the country saying, come to Alberta, et cetera, but it's not for the work. So relative to the size of the population, which is growing, job creation in Alberta has done very badly. The worst, actually, in Canada as a share of the working age population. Then finally, you look at wages, and it's been terrible. Average wages in Alberta over the last 5 years have grown by just 2% a year. Now, 2% a year is not a great raise, even at the best of times. But when inflation was surging, as it did after the pandemic, it got to as high as 8% at one point. Then 2% means you're going backwards. It means your wages are falling behind prices. And the decline in real wages relative to prices over the last 5 years in Alberta, down about 5%, the worst of any province. So now for a BC boy like yourself, Scott, here's the kicker. Alberta used to have the highest wages in Canada, and last year they were passed by BC. And it's just a growing contrast between these two provinces in terms of the economic conditions facing working people and the economic policies that the governments in the two provinces have enacted. And in Alberta, they've actively tried to suppress wage growth through various measures we can chat about. In BC, they've tried to support wage growth. And in both cases, it worked. BC wages have been growing quickly and have now surpassed Alberta. And Alberta's once upon a time advantage of 18% relative to the rest of the country has now shrunk. It's just 3% higher than the Canada-wide average. And again, when you adjust for prices in Alberta, rents and other housing costs and groceries and everything else are more expensive in Alberta than elsewhere. The Alberta advantage really has disappeared, unfortunately.
Yeah, and well, first of all, I want to come back to that in a sec. But Randy, do you think folks like on the ground? You're kind of on the ground in the community, in the workforce. Do you think folks know that BC has been doing pretty well when it comes to wages and unemployment and job creation, and that Alberta hasn't been doing as well, and over the last little while, I seem to hear blanketly across everywhere, everything's not great, right, for workers. What do you think?
Well, maybe they have a vague sense that we're doing okay, but I have to say that's news to me. The BC has surpassed Alberta as far as the wage growth goes. So I'm guessing, if I don't know, that most people don't know because I'm paying attention. So. At least I thought I was.
Yeah, no, exactly. What's interesting to me about that, and I don't know what both of you think, but like, I think that would be pretty obvious if you put in place policies to try to grow earnings of regular folks, that earnings are probably going to grow. And if you put in place policies that are designed to suppress earnings of regular folks, their wages and earnings are probably not going to grow. Like it seems pretty obvious to me, but people seem to be shocked by that. Like, in BC, they raised the minimum wage. I think the highest province in Canada. I think one of the territories might have higher minimum wages. Made it easier to organize and join unions, which is obviously going to push up wages and earnings. Done a number of other things that benefit working people. And in Alberta, they've done the opposite. They've frozen for, I don't know, I think almost 10 years, maybe not that long, since the NDP.
6 years,
Scott,
since
they've frozen.
2018, the minimum wage hasn't grown.
And
6 very high inflation years, too.
Now,
that's the problem.
I think as of next month or in a couple months, tied with Saskatchewan for the lowest minimum wage in the country, and done other things, under the guise of keeping inflation down or whatever, and, suppress public sector wages, all that kind of stuff. And like, shocker, wages and earnings are lower in Alberta and higher in BC. Like, I don't know why that's a shock to everyone. Is it just me that thinks that would be an obvious outcome?
Well, I think it is also a testament to the misleading information that we get through so much of our media, for example, where there's, in most of the newspapers and the major networks and so on, there's a clear pro-business bias to much of the reporting on the economy and the labor market and so on. So Alberta is still trumpeted as the land of free enterprise and lower taxes and a great place to make a living. But the actual reality for people at the, the grassroots level, the shop floor level of the economy is very, very different. Similarly, in BC, we get from much of the media, a kind of distorted, very negative perspective that BC's high taxes, high deficits, big government, and that's going to drive the province into bankruptcy. Yet the average worker in BC is doing much better, in part because of policies like the ones that you mentioned, Scott. So part of it is making sure we get the story out, and that was part of the reason for us writing this report.
I think I pay attention to all that stuff, but I was really struck by sort of that kind of juxtaposition of policies that, like, are doing what they intend in both provinces. And, like surprise, public policy actually works sometimes. And
Right.
if you design it to do the things that you want it to do, it might do the things that you want it to do. And in this case, I think you've really seen that. Like the
It's not rocket science, is it? If you want higher wages, try to boost wages. That's the solution. And BC's been doing that.
Yeah, I think maybe it's not just about wages either. It's a philosophical a huge philosophical difference between BC and Alberta. As our approach has more or less been utilitarian, want to get the greatest good for the greatest number, and you do that by raising wages and that sort of thing. Whereas in Alberta, it's the greatest good for the people at the top rather than the people lower down.
And I just want one of the points I think you mentioned, Jim, already is, and it's not like Alberta businesses aren't making money. It's not like there's not thriving industry in Alberta. It's just that it hasn't. I hate to say trickled down, but that hasn't trickled down to regular folks in Alberta. That's right? I'm not wrong about that?
Yeah, well, there's two stages, if you like, in the logic of the old trickle-down argument, that we've heard for years, ever since Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who kind of invented the whole idea that if you make things better for people at the top, cut their taxes, cut their regulations, roll back unionization, cut wages, then profits will be higher and the people at the top will do more. They'll invest more, they'll expand, they'll hire people, and that's how the benefits will trickle down. So there's kind of two stages to this argument. Number one, making life better and more profitable for those at the top will get them to do more. And then number two, them doing more will result in jobs and incomes that are shared amongst the rest of society. It turns out that really both of those steps are wrong and disproven by reality. Certainly, the trickle-down part has not happened. And I think, most people probably have a gut-level understanding of the fact that, even though corporate profits were at record highs in Canada in 2022 in the middle of the pandemic, and you see CEOs raking in tens of millions of dollars in salary and even more in bonuses, and some people living very high off the hog, I think most people understand that has not trickled down to the average person. But what's less well known is that this kind of effort to bend over backwards to make your economy and your society as friendly to big business as possible, as they've done in Alberta. The first thing Jason Kenney did when he got into power was deeply cut corporate taxes. And then they deregulated many of the different rules on industry, including some of the health and safety rules. They privatized some of the public services to great disastrous effect. Some of them, they actually, like the lab services, they had to bring back in because the private sector was completely failing at it. And obviously the measures to restrict wages and restrict unions that we've already talked about. So it is certainly more profitable in Alberta. Profits have increased dramatically in the oil and gas sector, but other industries as well. But that has not led to more economic effort from the business community. So when you actually look, and our report compiled the comparisons on business capital investment in new machinery, new equipment, new technology, innovation, Alberta comes out at the bottom or near the bottom of all the provinces, even though the business sector has been very profitable, more profitable than in any other province. So even that first assumption that making the world safe for business and profits will lead them to do more, even that part of it is false. Let alone that when they do more, the benefits will be shared throughout society. We need things like unions and higher minimum wages and public programs to share those benefits through society. So trickle down will not happen by itself. It will only happen if we make it happen. But we also need, I think, a broader vision. This is where, I'm interested as a union economist in developing a broader vision of how do you get the economy going? We want the economy going. We want investment. We want job creation. We want growth. And just cutting corporate taxes and boosting corporate profits does not do it. You actually need a more balanced, multidimensional strategy to get an economy going. And the Alberta experience, again, has shown you can't just dangle a big carrot in front of big business and hope that everything unfolds. It doesn't.
For sure, yeah. One of the things that I think was interesting in your report as well is, part of the dialogue in our country and our provinces has been about either overtly or a little subtly suppressing wages because of inflation. But there's not any. I mean, we don't really control inflation in Canadian provinces, do we? Like, it's kind of more of a national, more of a global thing that's driving inflation than it is wages in one province or another. And so I guess the question, Jim, is the inflation in BC isn't any worse than it is in Alberta, given the difference in the wage growth and earnings.
No, you're quite right. Inflation is a global phenomenon. There's no doubt about it. It happened pretty well everywhere after the lockdowns ended in the pandemic. And then we had shortages of things. We had shortages of semiconductors and building products and new cars for a while, and disrupted supply chains. Then you had the energy price shock that happened when the Russians invaded Ukraine. So this boosted inflation everywhere, and Canada's experience was really no different. It was actually a little bit less severe in Canada than in most other industrial countries. And there were no differences to speak of between provinces, and nor should you expect any. I mean, we're in a national economy. We all use the same currency. We all have the same interest rates. So you're never going to see big differences in inflation between provinces, and that was true as well. So this really highlighted a couple of old stereotypes that did not survive this experience of the pandemic. One is that inflation is usually caused by workers being greedy and demanding too high wages. And this is an idea that dates back to the 1970s, really, the 70s and 80s, the last time we had high inflation. There was a kind of a view among economists that the main problem here was wages were growing too fast, and you had what they called a wage price spiral. So when inflation picked up after the pandemic a couple of years ago, all these old economists went back and looked at their textbooks from the 1970s and said, oh my God, it's another wage price spiral. We've got to crack down on wages. So this is where the high interest rates came from, the desire to increase unemployment in Canada, which has been, successful, quote unquote successful. The unemployment rate went up again today in the latest Statistics Canada report, now at 6.4%. Compared to it was below 5% in the best times a couple of years ago. So they've been trying to weaken the labor market and reduce wage growth to cure inflation. Now, if that was the cause of inflation, then Alberta's inflation should have been half as fast as BC's inflation, because wages grew 2% a year in Alberta over the last 5 years, and they grew 4% a year, twice as fast in BC over the last 5 years. That's how BC managed to pass Alberta to become Canada's highest wage province. Yet the inflation rate was no different between the two. And in fact, in some months, it was higher in Alberta than for Canada as a whole, in part because of the big housing crisis that they're having in Alberta, which is really boosting rents. So it really disproves, Scott, the old assumption that inflation is caused by greedy workers demanding too high wages. It isn't. In this case, it was caused by obviously the pandemic and its aftershocks, the energy price surge, which was very good for the oil industry in Alberta, but very bad for Albertans. They have to pay the same high energy costs as everyone else under this scenario. And also driven by a good, healthy dose of corporate profit taking. Corporations in Canada had the highest profits. I'll say it again, the highest profits as a share of GDP in history in 2022, when all the rest of us were trying to grapple with the pandemic and inflation and getting back to work. They actually had never had it better, in part because they could use the pandemic as an excuse to increase prices well above prices well above costs, which boosted their profits. And the evidence is clear that wages were not the problem. And by suppressing wages in Alberta to half the rate that they were growing in BC and significantly lower than they were growing elsewhere in Canada, they got no payoff from that, no payoff in terms of lower inflation at all. They had the same inflation as the rest of us, but their wages didn't keep up.
Do you think, Randy, what do you think about all that?
Blaming workers for society's problem goes back a lot further than the 1970s, right, Jim?
Say it again, brother. You're right.
That's for as far as inflation. A lot of us can remember that. I do too, even though it was just before I became an industrial worker and everything. But yeah, we keep getting blamed, but it's the society's problems are like basically never our fault.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that I wanted to and I'm glad that you've been talking, Jim, about the work you did with the AFL and continuing to talk about it. But one of the things I think that's that we're going into an election in BC, and I think there's this sense that always this sense that we need to change and things would be better, the grass would be greener on the other side of the fence, so to speak, and we're heading into an election in the fall in BC, and no government is perfect, but I tend to think that our current government has done a good job through the pandemic, and in terms of workers and wages, we've just heard you say has done put in policies that have worked, that have achieved the objectives that they were trying to achieve, which is to increase wages and earnings for regular folks, along with corporate profits and stuff. And I just read. Maybe you saw this, Randy. I just read that, or maybe you did too, Jim, the former Green Party leader in BC who was in a coalition with the NDP to form government, going all in, saying the Conservatives are going to win the next election and that the government's done a terrible job and blah, blah, blah. And I just think, there's a problem with the reality of what's gone on versus sort of the narrative that gets spun out there about, you hear the same thing. It sounds like we're in Alberta if you're listening to the BC, the BC news and stuff, right? Like wages are down, inflation's up, unemployment's up, there's no jobs around. But it seems like, in fact, it's the opposite. But I don't think that message is out there. Like, do you think that message is out there?
Yeah, I don't think people like again. I think people think we're doing okay, but only as okay as their next raises are going to be from their boss if it's if they don't have a union, or from what their union can negotiate. Yeah, so I don't think people are feeling. I think because of the negativity that's kind of like in the world generally, people are slow to feel like they're really doing good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know, Jim, do you think there's anything we should be doing or could be doing to get more of that message out? I mean, I know you're doing your part, but the rest of us need to, I think, get the message out that, there are public policy decisions that work and work for working people. And, there are governments that are putting them in place, and it is doing better than the alternative.
Yeah, you pointed out, Scott, no government is perfect, and BC isn't perfect. Obviously, we've got some huge challenges here. Probably the housing challenge is probably the biggest of all. I mean, it's awfully hard to point a finger at the provincial government, say the reason for high housing prices is because of the provincial government. It's the reason for high housing prices is because of landlords and building developers and speculators and people who buy houses not to live in, but to treat them as an investment asset, as well as just the overall macroeconomic situation in Canada. And even on the housing front, the BC government's made a number of initiatives around things like opening up higher density housing around transit facilities. This new rule they've got about new rules on emergency exits in buildings, which is going to allow higher concentration of units in them. A number of other measures that, in fact, the federal government has even copied from BC. So in the labor area, I think their record has been very, very positive. The increases in the minimum wage have been really important, not just for people working at the minimum wage, but for people who might be paid $1, $2, $3 an hour above the minimum wage. When the minimum wage goes up, employers tend to adjust those wages as well, because you want to preserve the relativity against the minimum wage. The changes in labor relations laws that have been brought in, including the single-step certification, which means there's a much better chance for workers, especially in the private sector now, to form a union. And we have seen an uptick in union certifications in BC, which is very positive. How they've treated public sector workers. Again, a night and day difference versus Alberta. In Alberta's case, the government suppressed and threatened the public sector, broader public sector, including education and healthcare sectors, into some very, very weak wage agreements, where they had a 4-year agreement with 3.5% or 3.75% cumulative wage increase over 4 years, so less than 1% a year. at a time when inflation hit 8%. So you've seen a real reduction in real earnings for public sector workers in Alberta. In BC, on the other hand, the government provided some funding that allowed wages to keep up with inflation for the education sector and healthcare and others, keep up with inflation and a little bit more. So you've actually seen a slight improvement in real wages for the public sector here. So, across the board there, I think they've done some very positive things through a very challenging time. Of course, the pandemic was terrible. BC's health response to the pandemic was relatively good compared to other provinces. So, voters at the end of the day are just going to have to take, I think, a broader view and hopefully informed a bit by facts, not just by emotion. And in that situation, I think the government has a good chance of getting reelected in BC. The economy is among the strongest in Canada. Wages are the highest in Canada. And of course, it's a great place to live. One of the reasons I'm here now rather than my home, Alberta.
Yeah, for sure. What do you think about it? I know you're politically involved, Randy. You think we're in good stead, and people are going to look at the actual record of the provincial government in BC, or are they going to follow the tweets?
No, like you never know, but looks from my own point of view and from talking to people I know in the interior and everything like that, it looks like the Conservatives are going to get a heavy vote in the interior and a heavier than we'd like vote probably in the Fraser Valley where I'm from, but besides that, certainly around the city here and over on the Vancouver Island and the Kootenays and places like that, I think we're still looking really good. So I'm not expecting a change, but I know it's always really, really hard to get a third mandate. Doesn't matter how good things are going for anybody.
Yeah, for sure. And I know you're going to be out there, Randy, with us, talking to our members and talking to folks about what's at stake in the BC election for sure, and continuing to make sure that we get the message out, in particular about what's at stake for workers and what's at stake for working people in terms of where we're at. I mean, it'd be pretty easy, it seems, to over the next 5 years, drop from being the highest wages in the country and the fastest growth in earnings for working people just by implementing some of the policies that the Alberta government has put in place next door. So we got to be very, very wary of that. We're going to wrap up soon, but one thing you said, Jim, that and I want to get both of your perspectives on this is, a little bit of an uptick on union organizing in BC because of changes, primarily I think changes to the labor code, and I certainly don't think making it quite yet fair for workers to be able to choose to join a union, but making it a little bit fairer for workers to choose to join a union. And we've seen that in our union a little bit with an uptick in organizing. But is that enough to change the fortunes of the labor movement? I still see pretty low private sector union density in most provinces, most jurisdictions across the country, including BC. And I know Alberta's the worst. Not to pick on Alberta again, but Alberta's back to the worst union density, I think, of the provinces. But is that enough, or is there something else? This is just a kind of a general question. Anything else that we should be doing, or what can we be doing to increase union density moving forward, other than lobbying for better laws?
Yeah, well, Canada's unions, to be fair, have actually done a pretty good job maintaining overall union density in the economy. It's hovered around 30% or so of all workers, or just a little bit below 30%. But there's a kind of a contrast hiding behind that average, and that is the difference between public sector and private sector. So the public sector is very heavily unionized, about 75%, and that's grown a bit. In the private sector, in average in Canada, it's about 15% of workers who are in a union. So that's not enough. That means 85% of workers don't have the protection of a union contract and the wage gains and the job security and the representation that come with it. And the main reason for lower union density, BC's figure is about the same for the private sector as well, is very strong employer opposition to unionization. So as soon as they catch wind that, their staff might be looking at a union drive, they bring in the big guns, including, all kinds of threats, implicit or explicit threats about the future of the workplace, bringing in anti-union consultants, many of them from the U.S., to kind of wage a propaganda war against the union drive, even things like forced one-on-one meetings with staff to talk about it. So these are the challenges that unions have to overcome to get a certification. It's an uphill battle. It still happens because workers, in their guts understand one-on-one going to the boss, they're not going to get anything. You have to have some collective power, some bargaining power to make changes. The shift to this single-step certification is an important change. It means that the union can be certified. This is how we used to do it in the post-war era across Canada. The union is certified if you show that you've got a majority of people who've joined it and support it, rather than giving the employer a chance for this sort of sham vote that happens, where they, again, pull out all the stops to threaten and blackmail workers against voting for the union. And so we've had that single-step process in Quebec at the federal level now for a few years, and now in BC as well. I think the government in Manitoba is going to go in that direction as well, so that's positive. So it's a fairer process, and it's one that gives unions a chance. But it alone, Scott, you're quite right, won't turn the tide entirely. We're going to need, first of all, unions to put more resources and attention and modern thinking into how to organize some of the workplaces today. You guys are doing that big time. For example, your Starbucks drive has been very, very innovative and very successful. Congratulations on that. We're also going to need, I think, to look at other ways of sort of certifying and bargaining sector-wide or occupation-wide, rather than trying to do it, to use the Starbucks case again, one franchise at a time, or one cafe at a time, or one little workplace at a time. Have arrangements like are common in some industries in Canada, like in construction, for example, where you negotiate an agreement that applies across the whole sector or the whole region. That, I think, would be a big boost as well.
Yeah, for sure. Sectoral bargaining will be a whole other podcast episode.
Yes.
Good. I'm a big fan of moving towards some form of sectoral bargaining, but I'll let Randy comment.
Yeah, for my part, I'm a firm believer that organizing builds organizing. I'll tell you an anecdote that supports that. I was at a support rally for the workers at Anderson Pacific out in Maple Ridge recently, and they're newly certified back in December with the Steelworkers, and we're trying to get a new contract for them, and the employer was being a bit slow with setting up meetings, which is why we were there. And everybody from that crew came out after their shift. They were so happy that they're part of our union, that they can see that things are going to move forward for them. And I know that the word of them organizing has spread to the other non-union mills that are up and down the Fraser River still. And their happiness will spread beyond into other industries too, because of the enthusiasm that new members often bring to our organization and others.
Yeah, I've been around for a while, and I always say the most excited our members ever are is when they first join the union. And other than that, they only get excited if there's like a contract or a strike vote or whatever coming. It's a bit of a generalization, but people are pumped up when they join a union because there is that sense that you've collectively achieved something, and it's demonstrable. Now you're together. You've got a union. You're going to the bargaining table. You're going to get a contract for the first time. That is one of the most excited that members get about the union, and so capitalizing on that, I think is something that that's a good point, Randy. We do need to sort of wrap up here, and so if there's any closing comments, Randy, we'll start with you that you want to do before we shut her off.
Oh gosh, I don't know that I have any. Yeah, it's just we have to keep fighting and keep fighting. That's all I know. And I know I did it. Like I was the oldest worker in my workplace before I retired, and I care greatly about the young guys that I left behind. They're all like 30, 40 years younger than me, and it's their lives, their children's lives, and everything like that. It's so important. So I hope we can keep doing. In fact, I know we're going to keep doing the work for them to make their lives better and our communities better.
Yeah. Well, and I know you are, because you're a member now of the Steelworker Organization of Active Retirees, right? Mm-hmm. Chapter 314, right?
Yeah, I'm still a member of the NDP. I'm also a member of my local lawn bowling club. I'm going to try to make that better too.
Organize the lawn bowlers. Okay, and Jim, any last comments before we close her off?
Well, Scott, maybe I'll come back full circle to what I was saying at the beginning about being a union economist and why I think those two terms go together, and why I think unions have got such strong economic arguments to make for the value of unions and the value that we add to the economy. We aren't there to muss up the free enterprise system. We're actually there to give workers a chance to get a fair share of the wealth that workers produce. And without unions, you'll never have sort of successful, so-called middle class, as we call it. That is working people who are able to get enough income and security and benefits to have a good life and give their kids a good life, as Randy was saying earlier. So I'm a firm believer that we've got economics on our side in the union movement, and we should get more ambitious and more confident about expressing those economic arguments, whether it's at the bargaining table or in the political arena.
That's great. Yeah, no, I think that's a great thing to leave us with, Jim. If affordability is the number one issue that we're seeing every poll right now, that people talk about affordability being the number one issue, we should be doing everything we can to increase unionization, increase the role of unions in workplaces and in the society and in the economy, because that is one of the number one ways we can deliver kind of the appropriate share of wealth to the folks that need it, and that makes our community stronger. That makes our society stronger, is when real folks have the wealth and the means to participate in society. So just before I break the place here, I just want to thank both of you for being on episode number 11 of the Strongest Steel podcast. I'm getting the sign that we need to wrap things up, He just showed me the sign that said wrap up. But I just want to remind everybody who's listening, keep listening. We're doing the podcast monthly right now, and we this is like I said, episode 11 for July. If you've got any comments or questions for us, you can email at D3, like the letter D, the number 3, comms, COMMS at USW.ca. You can follow us at all of our social media stuff at USW District 3, the number 3. So USW District 3 on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or X or whatever. And yeah, if you're like I said, if you're a listener, keep listening. If you're not a listener, start listening and tell a friend. We're really trying to have conversations monthly about things that are important, things that are going on in our union, in our communities, in our society across Western Canada and Northern Canada, where we operate in District 3. So thanks again for joining us in the Strongest Steel podcast, and we will see you next month for episode 12.